The little cottage at the edge of the wildflower meadow had always been a happy place. For as long as Elena could remember, the small stone house with its cheerful blue door had been filled with the smell of her mother's baking and the sound of her gentle laughter. But now the cottage was quiet. The only sound was the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth and the worried rhythm of Elena's own heartbeat. Her mother, Anya, lay in her bed, her face pale against the pillows. A sickness had settled deep within her, a quiet thief that had stolen her strength and her smiles. Elena moved around the main room, trying to keep everything tidy. She straightened the quilt on her mother's bed and made a simple soup from the vegetables in their garden. Every few days, a kind man from the village would ride by with a small bottle of special medicine from the doctor. The medicine was the only thing that seemed to ease her mother's pain and bring a little color back to her cheeks. But Elena had seen the worried look on her mother's face when the medicine arrived, and she had heard the clinking of the few coins left in the small wooden box on the mantel. She knew the medicine cost money, and she knew their money was almost gone. As evening fell, the sky, which had been a soft gray all day, began to grow dark and angry. The wind started to howl, first as a whisper, then as a shriek, rattling the shutters on the windows. Storm was coming. Elena lit a single candle, its small flame fighting bravely against the growing darkness outside. She brought her mother a cup of tea and sat on a stool beside the bed, holding her hand. The storm arrived in full force, with rain lashing against the windows and thunder rumbling in the distance like a giant's angry drum. It was during the loudest part of the storm that a different sound cut through the noise. Not a crack of thunder, but a sharp, heavy knocking on the blue door. The sound was so sudden and so firm that Elena jumped. Anya's eyes fluttered open, wide with surprise and fear. Who would be out on a night like this? Elena, her heart pounding, went to the door and pulled it open. Standing in the storm was a man she had never seen before. He was not from the village. He wore a fine dark coat that was spotted with rain, and his face had a sharp, unfriendly look. He did not wait to be invited in. He simply stepped past Elena, dripping water onto their clean floor. He introduced himself as Mr. Blackwood. His voice was smooth, but it had no warmth in it. He looked around the small cottage as if he were counting every single thing they owned. He turned his cold gaze to Anya in her bed. He explained, without a shred of kindness, that he was the one who had paid for all her medicine. He said the doctor was his friend, and he had been very generous. But now he said it was time to be paid back. He named a sum of money so large that Elena gasped. It was more money than she had ever seen in her whole life. Anya began to cry softly, explaining that she did not have such an amount, that she could never hope to have it. Mr. Blackwood's smile was thin and cruel. He told her that if she could not pay, he would have no choice but to take her cottage and her land as payment. He said he would be back in 1 week's time for his money, or for their home. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back out into the storm, leaving the door open and the cold wind blowing in. Elena rushed to close the door, her whole body trembling. She looked at her mother, who was now crying into her hands, her shoulders shaking with sorrow and fear. In that moment, listening to the storm and her mother's sobs, Elena knew that she was the only one who could do something. She could not let Mr. Blackwood take their home. She had to find help. And she knew exactly who she had to find, no matter how scary the stories about him were. She had to find the giant rancher. The journey to the next valley felt longer and more lonesome than any path Elena had ever walked. The morning sun did little to warm her, and the cheerful songs of the birds seemed to mock the heavy worry in her heart. She followed the old deer trail her mother had pointed out long ago, during a happy picnic, when talk of the giant rancher was just a fun story and not a desperate hope. Her small feet ached, and the bread and cheese she had packed sat untouched in her bag. Her stomach too knotted with fear to feel hungry. Every rustle in the underbrush made her jump, and she clutched the strap of her bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. What if the stories were true? What if the rancher was a grumpy ogre who chased children away? But then she pictured her mother's pale, frightened face, and she knew she had to be brave. After hours of walking, the trees began to thin, and the land opened up into a vast green valley. It was the most beautiful land she had ever seen. Rolling hills covered in lush grass stretched out before her, and a clear, sparkling stream cut through the middle. Dozens of horses, their coats gleaming in the sun, grazed peacefully, and fat, woolly sheep dotted the landscape. In the distance, she could see a large, sturdy ranch house made of logs, with a big red barn beside it. The sheer size and order of the place was overwhelming. As she walked further in, she saw him, the giant rancher. He was even bigger than the stories had said. He was a mountain of a man, his broad shoulders straining the fabric of his simple work shirt as he bent over a long, broken section of wooden fence. Elena watched him for a moment, her courage almost failing her. He was using his bare hands to pull out an old, broken post and push a new, sharpened one into the earth. The muscles in his arms tightened like thick ropes, and the task that would have taken two ordinary men with tools, he did with quiet, immense strength. He hadn't noticed her yet. She took a deep, shaky breath and stepped out from the shadow of the trees, her small figure feeling tiny against the wide-open space. The sound of her foot on a twig made him pause and slowly turn around. Seeing him face to face was terrifying. His face was weathered and lined from years spent in the sun and wind, and a thick, bushy beard covered much of his jaw. His eyes, a deep and serious blue, looked down at her from his great height, filled with surprise and confusion. Elena felt like a little mouse looking up at a gentle bear. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the only sound being the whisper of the wind through the grass. The giant's brow was furrowed, not in anger, but in curiosity. He slowly straightened up to his full, impressive height, casting a long shadow that fell over her. The sight of this immense man, now looking directly at her, was too much. The fear, the long walk, and the terrible memory of Mr. Blackwood's visit all crashed down on her at once. A sob escaped her lips, and then the whole story came tumbling out in a rushed, tearful jumble. She told him about her mother's sickness, about the medicine, and about the mean man, Mr. Blackwood, who had come in the storm. Her voice broke as she repeated the most frightening part, the words she had practiced in her head all the way there. "They want to hurt my mom," she cried, her small voice trembling. "She is sick, and he is going to take our home." Thomas, the giant rancher, did not speak. He simply listened, his large, work-roughened hands hanging quietly at his sides. As Elena spoke, a change came over his face. The initial sternness in his eyes melted away, replaced by a deep, profound sadness. He looked at this small, brave girl, standing in his field all alone, fighting for her mother, and it seemed to touch a memory, an old hurt of his own. He gave a slow, understanding nod, a gesture that was both sad and full of resolve. He walked over to a large, calm horse that was grazing nearby. Without a word, he gently lifted Elena and set her onto the horse's broad back as if she weighed no more than a feather. Then, taking the reins, he began to lead the horse back toward his ranch house, his silent presence a promise that she was no longer alone. The week that followed was the longest of Elena's life. Each sunrise brought the heavy weight of Mr. Blackwood's return closer. Back in their cottage, she tried to act brave for her mother, Anya, whose health seemed to fade a little more with each passing day, worn down by worry as much as by sickness. They had spoken of Thomas's promise, and while it brought a flicker of hope to Anya's eyes, the fear was a stubborn shadow that would not leave. Elena spent her days watching the lane, not for the threat, but for the sight of the kind giant who had offered his help. She busied herself with chores, scrubbing the already clean floor and weeding the garden with a frantic energy, trying to keep the terrifying future at bay. Finally, the dreaded day arrived. The morning was deceptively peaceful, with birds chirping and a soft breeze rustling the leaves. Elena was inside, helping her mother sip some broth, when the distinct sound of hoofbeats, more than one set, broke the quiet. Her heart leaped into her throat. She peered out the window and saw them, Mr. Blackwood, looking even more pleased with himself than before, accompanied by two large stern-faced men who sat atop their horses like grim shadows. They dismounted and strode toward the cottage with a purpose that made Elena's hands turn cold. Just as Mr. Blackwood raised his hand to knock, a different, much heavier sound echoed from the other end of the lane, the steady, powerful trot of a single very large horse. Thomas arrived not with a shout or a threat, but with a quiet, undeniable presence. He rode atop his own massive draft horse, which made the other horses look like ponies. He dismounted with a smooth, easy motion, and as he walked toward the cottage, his great height and broad shoulders seemed to block out the sun, casting the three men in his shadow. Mr. Blackwood spun around, his smug expression dissolving into pure shock, his mouth hanging slightly open. His two men exchanged uneasy glances, instinctively taking a small step back. Thomas did not even look at them at first. His calm blue eyes found Elena's frightened face in the window, and he gave her the smallest, most reassuring nod. Then, he turned his attention to Mr. Blackwood. Thomas did not yell. His voice was deep and steady, like the rumble of distant stones, and it carried a quiet authority that demanded to be heard. He explained that he knew all about the debt, and more importantly, he knew about the unfairness of it. He spoke of Anya's sickness and how a good man helps his neighbors in times of trouble. He does not use their misfortune against them. He called Mr. Blackwood's actions what they were: the actions of a bully who preys on the weak. Mr. Blackwood's face flushed red with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. He tried to bluster, to insist that a deal was a deal, but his words sounded small and weak next to Thomas's calm truth. Reaching into the pocket of his worn leather vest, Thomas pulled out a small, heavy pouch. The clink of coins from within was a solid, honest sound. He said he was a man of his word, and he would settle the debt. But, he stated firmly, he would only pay the true and fair price for the medicine, not the outrageous sum Mr. Blackwood had invented. He held out the pouch, his large, calloused hand perfectly steady. For a long moment Mr. Blackwood hesitated, his eyes darting from Thomas's unwavering gaze to the faces of his own nervous men. He saw no support there. He saw the unshakable strength in the rancher's posture and knew he was defeated. With a scowl, he snatched the pouch from Thomas's hand, weighing it with a grunt of displeasure. Muttering under his breath, he shoved the money into his coat and, with a sharp gesture to his men, stormed back to his horse. They mounted up and rode away down the lane, their retreat as swift and quiet as their arrival had been loud and threatening. The shadow that had hung over the cottage for a week was finally gone, chased away by the strength of one good man. The quiet that settled over the little cottage after Mr. Blackwood's departure was a different kind of quiet altogether. It was not the fearful, waiting silence of before, but a deep and profound peace, like the calm after a storm has truly passed. Elena stood by the window, watching until the dust from the men's horses had completely vanished, hardly daring to believe the threat was gone for good. When she finally turned around, she saw that color had returned to her mother's face, a soft pink flush of relief and gratitude. Anya's eyes, once clouded with pain and worry, were now clear and bright, glistening with tears of happiness as she looked from her brave daughter to the kind giant who had saved them. In the days and weeks that followed, a wonderful change came over their lives. With the terrible weight of debt and fear lifted, Anya's health began to improve in earnest. The medicine from the village doctor, no longer a source of dread, worked its magic without the shadow of Mr. Blackwood hanging over it. She could sit in her chair by the window for longer periods, and soon she was able to walk out into her garden, feeling the warm sun on her face. Thomas became a regular and welcome visitor. He would arrive not with grand announcements, but with the steady, comforting sound of his horse's hooves. He came with practical help, using his great strength to mend the loose shingles on their roof and fix the wobbly fence post by the garden that had been neglected for too long. For Elena, Thomas's visits were the highlight of her week. The giant rancher, who had once seemed so intimidating, revealed himself to be a patient and gentle teacher. He showed her how to plant rows of vegetables so they would get the most sun and rain, and how to tell which greens were good to eat and which were weeds. He taught her how to care for animals, demonstrating how to approach a skittish chicken calmly and how to brush a horse's coat until it shone. He spoke to her not as a child, but as a fellow rancher, and Elena listened, her heart swelling with pride and a newfound sense of capability. She was no longer just a scared little girl. She was a learner, a helper, a protector of her home. The ranch in the next valley, once just a place from a frightening story, became a second home to her. She would sometimes go with Thomas to help with the afternoon chores, feeding the gentle sheep and checking on the new foals. The vast, open land that had once seemed so overwhelming now felt like a place of wonder and friendship. Thomas, in turn, found that the quiet loneliness of his big ranch house was eased by the sound of Elena's laughter and the grateful smiles of Anya. He had lived for so long with the memory of his own lost family that he had closed his heart away, but this small, brave girl and her kind mother had found the key. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, the three of them sat together on a bench outside the cottage. Anya was sewing, her hands steady and strong. Elena was telling Thomas about a book she was reading. It was a simple, happy moment, the kind they had all thought was lost forever. They were no longer just neighbors who had helped each other in a time of need. They had become a family, bound together by a promise kept and a kindness given. Elena knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, with courage, with love, and with the unwavering knowledge that even in a big world, the smallest act of bravery can lead to the greatest of friendships. If you enjoyed following Elena's brave journey and want to discover more stories about courage, friendship, and exciting adventures, be sure to subscribe to the channel for new tales every week. Join our community of story lovers, and never miss out on the next wonderful world waiting to be explored. Just click the subscribe button below.